let's start celebrating the Isaacus birthday party and also celebrating a 3 years project with lots of different stakeholders. And I'm very happy to see so many people here in place, and also I guess that online there's quite a lot listeners. So my name is Jaana Sinipuro, and there were some people who started the project Isaacus 2015, and I came along 2016 running the project as a project director. And it feels great to see so many people here, and it feels great to tell about different stories about those projects we co-funded. Remember, use tweets, Isaacus, Data tekee hyvää, and Sitrafund when you report from this event. We will have a very nice program starting from AI, going to personalized medicine and register data, and well, you will hear more about that now.
Yes, good afternoon everybody on my behalf as well, and welcome once more to this Isaacus birthday party. My name is Jukka Vahti, and I work as a senior lead at the communications of Sitrafund, and I'll be hosting this event together with Jaana. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm even more happy to see so many of you being here at the moment. Sitra is a Finnish future-oriented think tank, and that's why I hope that in this event you will not only be given and get ideas when it comes to the new ways to utilize data, but I hope that this event will also inspire all of you to think about what the upcoming era of data economy will look like. For in so many ways, the future is made today, and it's made by us all together. As we have a lot of very interesting speakers here today, and only so much time, without further intros, let's welcome our first speaker, Mr. Pekka Ala-Pietilä, who is the chair of the European Commission's high-level group on artificial intelligence, and who also chairs the National Artificial Intelligence Program. Pekka has a wide perspective on the issues of artificial intelligence, and in his presentation he will reflect a bit on what is artificial intelligence and digitalization's role in business and public sector. Welcome.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Isaacus Rothervius made a remarkable invention some 400 years ago. They told that he wasn't that pleasant man, by the way, to work with, but very effective. What is this new Isaacus second version of it, what we are now today talking about? From the outset, and with a little bit of benefit of hindsight, it may look simple and obvious, but all the good things, they look and feel simple and obvious once they have been discovered. There were 4 things which needed to be pulled together, quite different ones. The first thing was data, just having enough relevant data on matters which were important. The second thing which was needed was to make that data technically available. You needed to have a national data exchange layer. We call it X-Road, or in Finnish palveluväylä. We needed to do a lot of modifications to make the data compliant and actually usable. So that was the technical layer. But then we needed to make it legally available. And now as we speak, there's a law in passing in our parliament. Our government put that law for the secondary use of social and healthcare data, and it is believed to be the first law in Europe and also globally to allow this kind of a secondary use of data. And then thirdly, fourthly, the fourth layer we needed here was to make it operationally available. And now we have a single point of contact which has all the access rights, let alone the authority to negotiate and make that data available for all those parties which could make use of it. So simple, but not actually that easy to pull all those things together because they represent very different kind of nature of complexity. What does it then mean when you have in the field of healthcare data available as Isaacus II, if you may use that word, is planning to provide it? From the citizen's perspective, citizens will have better services, they will have them faster, with the higher quality and with the overall quality productivity parts taken to a different level. For healthcare professionals, it means that they can use less time for red tape, they can have support, they can have aid by the data, which helps them to make use of their full professional capability and probably provides also capabilities and dimensions for them to learn. For research, it provides crucial data to innovate, come up with new research findings, hopefully new products, new services, which are then adding to the benefits to the society. For public sector, this means that now things can be produced with the lower cost, increasing the productivity. There will be higher quality. And actually, these will be done in a way where there is a foundation for innovation and capability to, by combining different sources of data, create completely new categories of services. All this with the heightened clock speed and in that sense, better way of accelerating the development on the public side. And for business, it means crucial ingredient for creating products, services, innovations, which will then benefit the growth, create more jobs, and in that sense, hinged to the well-being of societies. But the interesting thing is that in all these matters, what is in the center? In the center is the citizen, people. They are served. So this is very human-centric way of taking the data in use and from multiple different facets and channels actually feed it back to the benefit of us, citizens, human beings. If we take then the macro perspective, and if we just quote Nobel Prize winner in economics, Robert Solow, he stated that in innovation in dense nations, the growth is stemming for 2/3 from the capability to apply the latest technology, and only for 2/3 for the incremental injections of labor force and capital. And that means that in countries like Finland, then the capability to innovate and have these crucial ingredients, raw materials for innovation in use, will actually be one of those building blocks for new ecosystems to arise and the existing ones actually gain in competitiveness in comparison to their competing ecosystems outside the domains of Finnish companies. So data is a key enabler in all of these. But in order to get there, that the data can be used in so many forms, shapes, applications and use cases, trust needs to be earned. And trust is something you don't want to lose because earning it back is sometimes almost impossible, and you need to be worthy of that trust. And with data, there are at least two levels of trusts which need to be maintained and further harnessed. And one is the personal data, my data. What happens to that? And GDPR, which came in effect in May this year, is an excellent example of very wise regulation. Not yet final, not all the interpretations are done, but directionally absolutely the right one. And if there were doubters in the beginning, look what was the recent news from the US. It was probably 2 or 3 days ago when the CEO of Apple and the Facebook equally, they made the urgent pledge that they would like to have a similar kind of regulation in the US. And there are many other nations which are following the suit. But the fundamental element is that we need to be individually in control of our data. It's our property. We need to give the consent. And once that is in place and established, then there's a foundation to create something where the data is in broad use. But that's not enough. We need to have another layer, which is the layer where these data lakes, reservoirs of data, they are pseudonymized, they are anonymized, so that that kind of a use is also equally trustworthy and can be taken in a broad scale to different stakeholders in different forms and shapes so that the data is usable, yet the trust is not jeopardized. At EU level, there is a great discussion and development underway to create ethical guidelines for different aspects. The previously mentioned high-level expert group on AI is having a task. It's made out of 52 experts in Europe. It was set up in June, and the first deliverable on the ethics side should be due by end of this year, so a very short period of time. 2 deliverables: what are the ethical guidelines of use of AI, and what is then the, in EU terms, it's a policy and investment recommendations. But that equals what are the competitive actions or actions to increase the competitiveness in Europe should do at mid and long term. On the ethical side, the aim is to create a trusted AI. And there are 2 different components. One is what is the intent of use case? And the second is what is the implementation of that use case? And even though it's a work in progress, I probably can share and could share that the fundamental thinking is that on the intent side of use of AI, we probably should apply more Roman law-based thinking, more ex ante, top-down stipulation. And there we have a core European values and core European values which are applicable here in the AI case are humanity, data ethics, democracy, equal access to use of AI, and then something a bit more complicated, which is normative reciprocity between the humans and AI. But when we come to the implementation side, the way how to think the regulation is different. We need to think probably more as case law-based, ex-post, regulation after we have understood how these implementations are done, and then we regulate in order not to stifle or actually create impediments for creating the competitive foundation for AI in Europe. And in the implementation side, probably the element which will become very important and is again linked to the data is the traceability. You probably are not capable and shouldn't regulate everything, but traceability of the use of data and AI might be crucial then on the implementation side. And these are hinging back to the number of things also on Isaacus, because many of the applications which will benefit, be it public, be it private, be it actually research, or even in the professional side, they will in due course take full advantage of AI, and therefore the linkage is crucial. In summary, I leave the artificial intelligence or the AI, high-level executive on AI, the other side, which is the competitiveness part. I only state that the data and data availability and data infrastructures as a key enablers, they are in a crucial role in thinking the actions to support and create a strong foundation for European companies to take advantage of AI. In summary, I would say that when usually there are great questions, great projects like this, 3 years, in the beginning the attitude is, when you start, that it is not impossible, which gives the hope for implementing it and gives hope for people to carrying on and passing those difficulties. And now we are in a situation where we can say that it is possible. It's done. We are here. So you have turned that one. The second implication, which is remarkable, is that all the consequences which will stem from here, we don't even understand yet. This is a case in point, encouraging one, and will set the scene for many others to come. And there's one very important element. This, you could almost coin a new term, and that would be enabled by public sector. Because this is truly enabled now by public sector. This is not decided by public sector, which is quite arguable, but this is enabled. Then, thirdly, this should not only be done in healthcare sector. This should be the encouragement to take similar approach, applied, of course, in so many other sectors where public sector can actually enable this thing. In Finland. And then additionally in Europe. We don't have a single digital market. That doesn't exist. And that has been praised and underscored in so many keynote speeches across Europe. Now we have a chance. We have an example actually do vertically things, where by this kind of examples we could establish and be encouraged to create a single market dimensions on a crucial sector in Europe. With AI and new technologies, there's one dimension which is of crucial importance, and that is the collective capability to learn, and actually learn faster than your competing entities. And I believe that this adds to the collective capability of Finnish society to learn faster. Crucial. And then finally, trust, which is the permanent or paramount and of permanent importance in building data and information-based services in digitalized societies. We should hope that this shows an example how governance and wise regulation is carried out. And therefore we all should hope that in Europe, in data related to use of AI, we would have the wisest regulators and the wisest governance network in place to understand when to regulate, when not to regulate, and have the capability to then do that aligned manner. All the best for your next steps. You have been the vanguard in an area which I believe will be remembered and will mark a turning point for many other new innovations to seek the courage and an example from something you have done so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Pekka, for your kind words. I especially like your notion of us being here for Isaacus II, because there's this little nitty-gritty small thing called legislation still, waiting for approval. So maybe next time there will be a time for Isaacus III, and we can celebrate in the Finlandia Hall or somewhere, like having this whole package delivered. And also, this trust and my data topics are very important. I guess when this Isaacus project started, we still had an idea that my data and personal data should be integrated part of the digital health hub functionalities or data sources. But then it showed up that it takes time to build on the collaboration between register authorities and also streamline processes for register data. So we see this new project, Sitra is working on human-driven data economy as a very logical extension to Isaacus project. And our next 3.5 years will go for around the personal data and the consent-based data sharing. And but trust overall and ethical guidelines, I think that's something that Finland as a country can show to be a European model for other countries as well. But let's have a look at the project. Most of you know about Sitra. Just shortly about the background, there's an own legislation about Sitra. We are an independent government agency focusing on public sector innovations, while Business Finland is focusing on more like company innovations. I think Isaacus project was more on the doing part. We are a think and do part, but think and do tank, that's what we call us. Isaacus was focused very much on doing. In the next project we will focus also the thinking part, creating a new framework and new method for data sharing. Isaacus project was a 3-year project by Sitra. The main focus was on preparing the operating plan for the new digital health hub, or the service operator, as you can read in some papers. Creating functionalities, defining the models, operating models for new national permit authority, and also the operator gathering data, providing secure access to Finnish data resources. But we also funded quite many pre-production pilots, and I'm happy to see so many of our partners here today. And of course, the name for Isaacus project, that's what we are celebrating today. He was born in 1st of November 1572, guy who started gathering the Finnish register data. Then this act concerning the secondary use of social and healthcare data, you will hear more about it later on in ministry's presentations. This year we've been working in a formal temporary steering group. So ministry had invited a working committee setting up the plans for the final permit authority and the digital health hub. If you look at the history, of course the background is in health growth strategy, some other national strategies that are quite unique, different ministries working for common goals and setting objectives for achieving those goals together. Our project started in October or in August 2015. At the same time, the working committee started preparations for this new legislation. And the working term was quite long, ranging from April to December 2017. During the time, there were different rounds of commenting rounds, hearings. So the proposal was finally left to the Parliament in October 2017. Then the parliamentary work started. There was hearings from the Constitutional Committee, Constitutional Law Committee, and Social Affairs and Health Committee, and they suggested some amendments. So many rounds, many expert hearings, and those hearings started in April 2018. Then there was quite a long time. We started, the temporary steering group was running its operations. There were many worries about the new legislation, but now finally in October 2018, adjusted proposal is returned to Social Affairs and Health Committee by the Ministry. So far, so good. At the same time, Project Isaacus, we got our first funding applications in March 2016. Then we started from common goals, working together with different ministries, and then it showed up soon that actually to fulfill our goals we need some additional money, so Sitra applied some additional funding from Sitra, so the total budget for this project was about 7 million euros out of pocket money, not including Sitra staff. And our funding shares for projects varied between 30% to 70%. Phase 1 was completed in September 2017, but then we extended our project time to allow more time for projects to work on the results. And also, if you think about similar projects in Finland, it's very hard if you don't have budget money for innovating and developing new things. So the handover wasn't so easy at that point because there were no law. So we decided to continue this project. At the same time, the government draft budget had some money for setting up the National Permit Authority. In 2018, it was 1.8 million, and this year it's 3.3 million euros in a draft budget for setting up operations for Digital Health HUB and the National Permit Authority. And as I said, this year we've been working with temporary steering group, and actually it's quite much work, almost 35 Mondays totally we've been working on, and here I would like to thank our project management office, Oophorectomy, who's been doing a very great work at the ministry together with the working committee. Thanks to our partners, we were focusing on 2 sets of projects: improving research infrastructure, researcher services, but also testing the new technologies and innovations. Data lake solutions were a hype we weren't expecting. And we also made evaluations about AI technologies, evaluations about data lake solutions at the Varsinais-Suomi Hospital District and HUS Hospital District. If you look at the numbers and check those numbers, 7 million was the Sitra's money, but then if you think about whole funding, I think the total value out of pocket money for this project was about 20 million euros, because that's the share from all organizations, our partners collaborating, putting their resources during these 2 years we made pre-pilot projects. So that's a big amount of money. We've invested about, we have like 30 million euros now reserved for biobanks and national expertise, centers of excellence. But actually in this project we spend quite a lot of money as well, and time. What was we doing? We funded about 33 projects, and 8 of those were these pre-pilot, technical pilots, building of infrastructure. We had about 25 international study tours, organizer trips to benchmark other countries. Then 30 local events, mostly organized by Sitra, for networking, for meetings like this, seminars like this. We've organized a couple of roundtable meetings, and attendance were globally about 50, and half of them were attending regularly in 5 roundtable meetings. A very well-functioning network we shouldn't lose in the future. And when we are speaking about user-driven mindset for the new authority, that's based on our 70 end-user interviews. So when we talk about customer-driven attitudes, that's based on the facts. Learnings. And I'm not as sad as that little guy there. It would have been great to be here and celebrate both the legislation and this project and all the marvelous results we got from those pre-pilot studies and things that had happened after that. But maybe we were trying too big, aiming too high. There were too many reforms maybe running and regulatory reforms also simultaneously. Or then maybe just a sense of urgency was missing. I don't know which one is true. And this mindset change, I think we should be more careful listening to customers, listening to companies, listening to aligning our processes to end users, and also talking with citizens and individuals about how they want our services to look like, how we should communicate with the citizens. And then now when we are going towards the implementations, I think there's lots of expertise in the companies. So we should find a ways to do a close collaboration with the companies as a public organizations. When we are planning our new technical environment, ICT services for the Digital Health HUB, safe environments for using the data, we cannot really have the latest information, latest skills on our own. We need to collaborate and find new forms to exchange knowledge from between the public sector and companies. And then maybe we Finns should be not to be scared about doing choices. We could pool all the resources, all the money, all the funding, public sector funding to commonly chosen goals. It's not good if we count all that funding sources together and still work for separate goals. I think now it's time as a small country to make selections and even work in a more streamlined way, funding those resources together, funding those goals together. And of course, in the future as well, we need to focus on trust. Then the highlights from this project. Of course, the cross-sector dialogues. And also, while we were doing this project, there were very nice interactions, very nice discussions with different register holders. So I think at the practical level, the collaboration in the project worked very well. And at the grassroots level, I think people gained a lot of new insight while sharing their pains and ideas together with others. And of course, during these 3 years, there was a bunch of amazing individuals doing amazing things in these projects. So that's very good to know also in the future that it's not the shortage of skills. We have marvelous people available for new kind of things. And also this hype for data lake solutions. That was a little bit as a surprise to us when we started funding those projects, how big they become and how useful they show up to be. So I think from the hype, we went to the quite nice practical proofs that it was worth of investing in those technical trials and solutions, new kind of infrastructures. And I think there's a very good path forward from those beginnings. We will publish today our report about the key findings, suggestions, our recommendations from this project, and you can download it from the website. And it might be, there will be a short English summary from the findings from the report later this year, at January probably. But of course, it might be good if we go to if the legislation is passed, then maybe it's time to document that as well as a joint kind of document for this whole project. So all other countries, they launched their moonshot initiatives, all of us, genomic information. There's lots of things happening around those things. But I think we are much more hands-on people. We are much more concrete. and we don't have the great means. We are network people, we are very frank people, we don't overtell, we just do. Small steps, baby steps. Maybe we are using ladders sometimes to get to the moon, not the space shuttles, but at least we are doing something. So let's be proud of it, and thank you. And that was my very subjective view on this project. Let's now focus on more objective view of the lessons learned about this project and these kind of reforms. I welcome Ville Aula to continue from the team. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Jana and Sitra team, for inviting me to talk in this event. I will be here presenting some of my research on the Isaacus project and the Finnish secondary data legislative reform based on research that I conducted in the Oxford Internet Institute last spring, and now that I'm continuing also doing this autumn in the London School of Economics. My background is in political science and sociology, and what I want to make here is kind of a bird's eye view to what do we have to take into account when we are doing this kind of very big, extensive reforms in a country which is already quite sophisticated in its health data infrastructures, and what does it mean to change this kind of environment. And in the end, we aren't now in the situation that Isaacus Digital was 500 years ago. We have 500 years of tradition and systems in place. And the key question I'm asking here is that what is the role of public institutions in this kind of reform? What's happening when the institutions are highly developed, when they are committed to future, but they are committed to different kinds of futures, when they have hundreds of years or decades of experience in doing things? And in the heart of all these questions is who decides who can use what data? This is a question we time and time again face when we try to integrate data in the manner that the Isaacus project is doing and in the manner that we are doing when we propose legislation like the secondary health data legislation. In the background of all these kind of things, why this is relevant to think about is that we have, at the moment, two very different kind of ideas about what do we do with data. On the other hand, we have the idea of big data and open data, where we are celebrating the idea there is more of it, and we can make new ideas and new kind of analysis based on these new data sources. But at the same time, we also have a lot of theories and opinions that data is always local, that you can't separate data from its original context, and when you separate it from there, something happens and you can't really make use of that data in the way that you were originally making it. Both of these are very well present in the project here, in both Isaacus and the secondary health data initiative, and these two quotes from other researchers, I think they capture quite well what kind of different attitudes do we have towards data. That do we want it to speak for itself, or do we think that it's always situated somewhere and we have to take that context into account? The first lesson that we learned from the Isaacus project is that, as I said, we have 500 years of tradition now here, and what has happened is that we have very highly sophisticated data regimes already at place. And data regimes is a concept I propose in my research to understand what is happening in the public sector setting when you have different legislation, when you have different mission, when you have different idea of what this data is about, why are you gathering data, what do you do with that data, how are you storing that data, and what do you end up having done with that data. And in my analysis, I'm concentrating on three of these institutions: the Social Insurance Institution, Kela, Statistics Finland, and National Institute for Health and Welfare. And I can say that they have quite different attitudes towards what is happening with data and what we should be doing with that. What happens is that when we now want to change something, when we want to reconfigure the whole infrastructure in the manner that it would be unified and uniform, we of course get tensions between these players, because if you've been doing this for decades, you don't want to change your things overnight. And what I'm saying here is that these are legitimate differences. These are not differences about someone being recalcitrant about change. This is not about someone not being committed to innovation, but it's about people being committed to different ideas. People balancing in a very different way what are the benefits and the risks of opening data, collaborating, integrating data. And why I wanted to make at first the point of big data versus the local data is that the big and open data movement wants to more emphasize on the benefit side, whereas most of these institutions which are actually governing the data, they have to pay more attention to the risks of publishing that data. And because the public data institutions in Finland are the ones who own the legislation, they make the decisions who gets that, and they are the best experts of their own data, they are the arbiters of the public good on some level. But because they have different ideas of what is the public good, we end up having a lot of tensions, especially on the legislative level, of what we should be doing. This is a list of the main tensions that were found in my study. And as I said, who decides who can use what data is the most important of these disputes. It goes deeper than just like being squabbles over data. It goes deep to the data origins, which is about how is data produced and retained, how does this influence the data, and what is there to be done with that data. It goes to the purpose of use, that if we gather data for statistical purposes, can it be used for some other purpose? If I'm gathering data for one purpose, can I give it to my friend next door to use it for another purpose? Or can I give it to another, maybe research team somewhere in Europe to do something with that? This is a very fundamental question about the purpose of use. Is it research? Is it statistics? Is it medical use? Is it management use? Very different ideas what we do there. We also have differences in the data governance and what would the governance in the new system look like. And as Jana was saying earlier, we have a lot of different views about what is the best way of actually even advancing big and open health data. And because there are different ideas, we end up being a situation where if we sit in the coffee table, we can all nod to each other that yes, we are committed to big and open data. We are committed to working for the future. But once you start actually scratching underneath, you see that we have very different ideas of what is the future about. And time again, I want to emphasize that these are legitimate differences stemming from the different backgrounds that the institutions have, what the practitioners have, what the disciplines have. And the project like Isaacus, it had to compete with these ideas and try to find common ground. What is the thing that we could be doing now and what we can together commit to? And as Isaacus started and the legal reform started back in 2015, it was on some levels a trailblazer. There weren't in Finland so many similar kind of projects, and as it was said, the legislative project is quite unique in Europe and in the world. And what happened is that throughout these 3 years, we've seen a lot of new projects starting, which are practically about the same matters. We have a lot of people here who have their own projects. The institutions have their own projects towards their own futures of health data. And what started as kind of a standalone and a unique project had to compete a lot with other projects which are related to health data. Especially on the legal level, we have been now waiting for almost a year for the law to be passed because there are so many different laws. The National Healthcare Service reform is quite prominent in these discussions, and the whole issue has been overshadowed by it. This does not mean that the work has been in vain, or it doesn't mean that because we have differences and tensions that we can't work forward. Rather the opposite. The Isaacus project and all these pilot projects, they've kind of proven that even though we have these tensions, once we actually start working together, once we actually have people there on the same table working with practical data problems of infrastructures, systems, metadata standards, categorizations, we can actually go forward. But it looks rather different when we are on the legal side, because that's where the differences are more pronounced, and we have to talk about very different kind of reform when compared to the ICT kind of reforms. And the good thing in the Isaacus project has been that it has provided a test bed for the legal reform. A test bed to try out how could things be going, what could be happening, how could we perhaps work forward. Without the project, I'm confident to say the legal side would not have gone as far as it's been at the moment, because we would not have the same experiences from what's practical and what's possible. On the other side, even on the legal team, once we start having something tangible to work with, for example, government enterprise architecture plans, they start working as kind of boundary objects that everyone can start working with. You can watch that, okay, if we make this kind of decision, how would the system change? How would the ICT infrastructure change? How would the institutional relations change? And making things tangible really helps in finding common ground. When we have these two kind of things, we have the practical side of the Isaacus and we have the more legal side of the legal reform, we also can see two attitudes towards solving problems. On the one hand, we can have this kind of idea that we can only move forward after everyone agrees. And on the other hand, we can have an attitude that, well, by moving forward, we will get everyone aboard in these changes. And these are very different attitudes towards change, very different attitudes towards taking risks, very different attitudes towards thinking about what are the balances of risks and benefits. And what I propose is that the ethical, legal, and the institutional relations are at the moment more on the kind of side of that we have to agree first, and we can then go forward. Whereas the practical side has been more in the latter perspective that, well, let's move forward and we can get everyone abroad. I can't say which one is the best. You can't say which one is the universally the best because they refer to very different institutional matters. They refer to very different attitudes of what we are working with, and they are working in different ways in different contexts. And what I want to invite you to think is that in what perspectives are we then kind of looking to find agreement before we can go on, and in what perspectives and what respects, what questions, what contexts, where do we first can go forward and then work out disagreements on the way? I don't have an answer, and I hope that by thinking this, we could start having answers more and we can find common ground to these questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ville, for the very interesting lessons and insights on the Isaacus project. And I think we have a few minutes here if anyone has any comments or questions at this point to Ville, for example, on what we just heard. Anyone? If not, then I have a minute to have some water because I have a turbo flu going on, so this is something I really need to do. But moving on, next we are going to take a look at the big picture. And how do we get from the effective use of registered data towards new beginnings, whatever they may be? We're about to hear interesting insights concerning the use of genomic data. And this is particularly interesting for us here in Finland, as there's a lot going on in this field at the moment. We have had a Biobank Act in force since 2013, and at the moment it's being updated. And the National Genome Center is being established. We also have the FinGen project, which is one of the very first personalized medicine projects at this scale, and which brings together different actors from both public and private sectors, and also thousands of Finns. Just to name a few examples on what's going on. Our next speaker is Mr. Olli Torkamani, who is a director on genomics and genome informatics at the Scripps Research Translational Institute. He'll talk about opportunities and challenges for genomics in individualized medicine. Welcome on stage, Mr. Torkamani.
Thank you, first of all, to the conference organizers for inviting me to speak. As was mentioned, I'm Olli Torkamani, Director of Genomics and Genome Informatics, the Scripps Translational Science Institute. It's an institute in San Diego. Before I start, I'm a minor shareholder of Human Longevity, Inc., and I receive grant support from the NIH, just standard disclosures. You shouldn't believe anything that I say. So I would like to start with bring it down a little bit. The topic is quite broad, and I'll make it a little bit less broad with a still broad statement that genomics has and will continue to accelerate disease prevention, detection, and treatment. I would like to focus more on my comments on the disease prevention and detection side of things. I'll mention some things around treatment as well. But I think that prevention and detection are really the exciting upcoming areas where you can use individual level genetic data to start providing useful health insights or other insights to individuals that they can actually act upon and make a difference in their lives and in their kind of health journey through life. So starting with disease prevention, I think it's almost self-evident that genetic risk factors have to start playing a more and more prominent role in disease prevention. And that comes from the simple, observation that genetic risk factors are essentially the earliest significant contributor to disease risk that you can measure in a person. You're born with your genome. It doesn't change for the most part. And for many diseases, it's a significant factor in your underlying susceptibility to disease. That's in contrast to clinical risk factors that are used now to guide decisions that arise later in life, say typical things like blood cholesterol levels, blood pressure levels, etc. They deviate from norms sort of later in life, closer to disease, and that's sort of when they're used to guide this sort of decision making. So to start with, we should start with kind of the traditional use of genetics in health management, and that is looking at monogenic risk. So what does that mean? Monogenic risk simply means health risks that are due to changes in a single gene. So this would be rare diseases, for example, in pediatric populations, or familial forms of common diseases. So for example, BRCA mutations in breast cancer, for example, would be a monogenic example of monogenic risk. So these contribute a relatively small part of disease risk overall, but can be highly informative. And so we've gotten quite good at monogenic risk identification through the use of genome sequencing, for example. But it tends to be applied now in a phenotype first approach. So what do I mean by that? Is that it's used to provide diagnoses when there's an overt disease presence, or clarify familial risk in individuals. So in other words, you start with some sort of interaction with the medical system. Either you have a relative that had early onset cancer, or a child that has a rare pediatric or a rare disease. Then you use genome sequencing to identify essentially the cause of that early onset cancer or rare disease and provide a molecular diagnosis there. And the diagnostic yield, that is the number of times you can successfully identify the genetic cause of the disease, varies quite a bit, and it really just depends on how the study is doing their ascertainment of the people that they include in the study. If you're sequencing people, that have a cough, diagnostic yield is going to be low. If you're sequencing people that have a very specific phenotype, the diagnostic yield is going to be higher. So this is one opportunity, I think, for example, in these combination of biobank and health data. For example, Vanderbilt in the United States has shown you could mine health record data to find people who have signs of a monogenic disease, go and sequence them and identify the actual cause of their disease, and then you can start informing living family members who share the risk because they're related. You can actually confirm whether or not they are also at risk for disease. And we've gotten quite good at this now, as I mentioned. So for example, in San Diego, where I came from, there's a hospital there, Rady's Children's Hospital. It's one of the largest children's hospital in the United States. They set a record recently for the fastest turnaround from phenotype to genotype. That is a child with a rare disease to a molecular diagnosis in 19.5 hours. So that's actually from acquiring the sample to returning a result. And in these kind of very sick pediatric populations, that can be useful if you need to find an intervention quickly before kind of more long-term damage is done. But I think the opportunity moving ahead is actually to go to genotype first rather than phenotype first. So what I mean by that is identify health risks in healthy people. So rather than starting with sick people to identify the cause of their disease, now you want to start with a healthy person, sequence their genome, and then identify what diseases they're susceptible to. This is actually a much, much harder problem than the phenotype first problem. The phenotype first problem allows you to focus down on kind of small regions of the genome to identify causes of disease. There are a huge number of variants of unknown significance, meaning they're sort of rare, they're consistent with being disease causative, but we have no idea what the impact of those genetic variants are. And there's very few groups actually pursuing this genotype first approach. So for example, Geisinger is one of these institutes that just started providing, so this is an institute in Pennsylvania, they started providing whole genome sequences or whole exome sequences to their patient population now, and they think about 5 to 15% of people will get a benefit from this, finding out if they have a familial risk for breast cancer or cardiomyopathy, kind of actionable rare conditions. But the variance of unknown significance problem is just part of the problem, I think, and there's a bigger problem that can be tackled with the combination of health data plus genetic data that you are all building, and that's to go past just calling a variant pathogenic or not. And to explain that further, I'll use BRCA mutations as an example. So imagine that you don't have a family history of disease, for example. You had your genome sequenced, you have a positive hit for a pathogenic BRCA mutation. So now you want to make a practical choice in terms of what are you going to do about your risk. You could do nothing. You could go for more intensive screening through mammography screening, or you could go for a more invasive approach where you remove organs that are at risk for developing cancer, either mastectomy or oophorectomy. So if you wanted to do something about it, the choices are basically between intensive screening or an invasive procedure. To make that choice, you need to know what the degree of risk is that you're actually exposed to. So just saying that your BRCA mutation is not enough. There's this kind of underlying misperception that genetics is deterministic, and that's not the case. It's probabilistic, and you need to know what the degree of probability is that you will develop this disease to make this sort of decision. If you're at somewhat elevated risk, which is possible in BRCA mutations, you might opt for just intensive screening. If you're at much higher risk, 5-fold risk relative to the population, then you might opt for a more invasive intervention. But then knowing the degree of risk is also not really enough. Let's say you know you're at high risk, then the question becomes, well, at high risk for what? BRCA mutations can predispose you to breast cancer, ovarian cancer, and a number of other cancers as well, breast and ovarian being the primary ones. And there's differences in which mutations predispose you to which types of cancer. So that's illustrated here on the right side, where along the x-axis is just the BRCA gene, along the y-axis is your relative predisposition to breast cancer versus ovarian cancer, breast cancer being above the line, sort of at the 1.0, and ovarian cancer being below the line. So you see there's regions in the gene that tend to be more enriched with, if you have a mutation in particular regions, you'll be more predisposed to developing ovarian cancer. In other regions, you might be more predisposed to developing breast cancer. So knowing that sort of information, which I think can be teased apart in large biobanks with associated genetic data, then you can start making much more informed decisions about your health. The other, I think, more exciting application, at least for me, is to go after polygenic risk. So as opposed to monogenic risk, where you're just talking about a single gene, polygenic risk is really the type of genetic risk that is more relevant to the vast majority of people who don't have a family history of disease. And polygenic risk essentially means risk due to a number of genetic factors, more than one genetic factor, usually in the hundreds, rather than a single event. Just to explain briefly what polygenic risk is and how the genetic variants are discovered. You go through what's called a genome-wide association study that Finland has obviously played a big role in, where you have individuals with and without a trait, their genetic data. You genotype them across millions of known genetic variants that are shared across the population. And then you do essentially you get a statistical result that looks like the middle here, where the x-axis is just the genome and the y-axis is the significance of the association of each genetic variant with disease of interest. So each dot here, you can't even see the dots at the bottom, there's so many, is a single genetic variant, and the ones kind of going upwards are actually associated with the condition of interest. So a polygenic risk score, what is done, the other thing I should mention is that each of these significant events is associated with a weight as well, kind of a degree to which it predisposes you to disease. So a polygenic risk score is essentially taking these genetic variants. There's other similar ways of doing this, but you take these genetic variants, sum them up for an individual, and you get their polygenic risk for disease. Pretty straightforward. And when you sort of look at the distribution of polygenic risk here on your right side, you can see that essentially where the orange dots are people that have the higher risk, or the risk-associated version of each variant. The more enriched you are with these variants, obviously the higher your risk, and it starts to separate out your cases and controls, people with and without disease. So this information previously was not actionable. If any of you have done 23andMe, it's the type of information that 23andMe used to return, and now does not, although they're getting back into it. At that point in time, it wasn't really actionable. Now this sort of information is actionable, and I think really we need to start thinking about providing this information to people that want it. So here's an illustration of how actionable it is for various conditions. Coronary artery disease, breast cancer, and prostate cancer are shown here, where you define polygenic risks for people, and in this case I've just divided it into people in the top 20% of risk, the middle 60%, or the bottom 20%, and sort of various outcomes that you can look at. So for a heart attack, you can see the general way you try to prevent a heart attack, besides lifestyle changes, is through statin therapy. Statins, there's some debate as to how useful they are, especially for preventing a first heart attack. But you can see here that each one of these individuals shown here is treated with a statin. The number of heart attacks prevented is in black. So you get a much greater benefit here from going on a statin if you're at high risk versus low risk. The number needed to treat is threefold difference. So if you treat people at high risk, they're at a much greater chance of actually preventing a heart attack that might have happened. You see a similar kind of situation for breast cancer. This is breast cancer screening for mammography. Mammography is associated with a pretty high false positive rate. Over 10 years, about 20% of women will have a false positive mammography result. And the way, at least in the United States, that this is done is essentially when you turn 50, you start getting biennial mammography. Well, if you sort of lay people out by their risk, then you can get a much greater sort of true positive rate in high-risk individuals versus low-risk individuals. The other aspect of it is that actually if you look at the risk associated with the risk for breast cancer at 50 years old, and you use that as your like threshold to start screening, the difference between people in this tier and this tier is about 10 years as to when they achieve that level of risk. So these people can probably delay screening for at least 10 years and avoid 20% of them getting a false positive result, and the people in the top can accelerate screening. It's a similar story for prostate cancer as well. I think the challenge driving this forward is how to, first of all, use it to drive and prioritize behavior change. Part of the problem is we're used to thinking of people as either at high risk for disease or just average risk for disease, and that comes from these monogenic, the kind of tradition of monogenic genetic testing, where either you get a positive result, which means something, or you get a negative result, which doesn't really mean much. It doesn't mean that you're not at high risk, it just means you're not at high risk for what had actually been tested. So usually you see things divided this way, a high-risk person and an average person, and all the focus is on the high-risk individuals. They need to change their behavior, go on drugs, do invasive procedures, etc. But I think actually we should start thinking about what about people who are at low genetic risk. Perhaps we've got this a little bit wrong. Maybe we should start thinking about, hey, if you're at low genetic risk, but at high clinical risk for a heart attack, for example, then maybe those are the people that you really need to prioritize lifestyle changes for, and the high genetic risk people are the ones that, of course, they should adopt healthy lifestyle, but perhaps drug therapeutic intervention is more useful for them. Sort of makes sense. If you're at low genetic risk, but at high clinical risk for disease, well, it's not your genes that are responsible for your risk for heart attack, it's probably your environment and behavior. So that's probably what you should focus on changing. The other challenge is how to deliver, store, and use polygenic risk information. In the United States, it seems that the direct-to-consumer commercial approach is starting to become the dominant one, and if you don't want that to be the case, in Finland, and you should start thinking about how to start delivering this information. 17 million people have gotten direct-to-consumer genetic testing done. It's a pretty significant. That's grown from 12 million less than a year ago. And you can start determining polygenic risk information from this data, which we actually do in our own research. The polygenic risk could be provided by providers or payers. The problem, especially again in the United States, with payers providing this is that often the benefits are much longer term, and in the US people switch from insurance plan to insurance plan, so it might be difficult to convince an insurer to pay for a test that has a long-term benefit that might benefit their next insurer. And the approach that I think Finland has a great advantage in is just driving it from public policy, making it a sort of public sort of effort. And that also helps with ownership and privacy issues that come along with the commercial approach versus the public approach, assuming you trust your government. Then, regardless of how this information is delivered, I think it's very important that it be on demand. I'm sort of a fan of the smartphone delivery system. It doesn't necessarily have to be that, but it needs to be on demand. No physician is going to wait to prescribe a drug, is going to wait for, say, a pharmacogenetic test result before they prescribe a drug. They'll just make the prescription. So you need to have that information on hand when a clinical decision is actually being made. So with the remaining time, I just want to talk very briefly about another area of genomics that I think is highly exciting and a little bit more future-looking, and that's disease detection using circulating nucleotides. That's just DNA that is circulating, or RNA circulating in your bloodstream. I think you will see over the next decade or so that use of this molecular signal is going to start becoming quite important. So this started from non-invasive prenatal screening, which hopefully most of you are familiar with. The idea here is you have a pregnant woman. You want to determine if the fetus has chromosomal abnormalities or not. The previous way of doing this was through sort of not very accurate imaging and more invasive tests. Now what can be done, or what's been realized, is in the mother's or soon-to-be mother's blood, there is DNA from her own cells and from the fetal cells. You can sequence that DNA and actually look for small differences in the number of DNA fragments coming from different regions of the genome and identify chromosomal abnormalities that way in a completely non-invasive way. This can go a lot further than it is now. Right now, they're just looking at big chromosomal changes, but you can get information on BRCA mutations, for example. Then the question becomes, do you actually return that information for adult onset conditions for a fetus? Circulating tumor DNA is an interesting upcoming space as well, where it's stored to being used relatively routinely now, or at least starting to pick up for looking at or monitoring the response of tumor to drug treatment. So you can actually start seeing a recurrence earlier by sequencing circulating tumor DNA than you could by doing an imaging study, for example. So this can provide you information about whether or not a drug treatment is working more rapidly than you could via imaging. And this is going to, well, I think it'll become one of the ways that cancer screening is done as well. So you could imagine now, just like you get an annual blood cholesterol test done, you get an annual circulating DNA test done, and that might determine, you might be able to use that to screen for cancer. And more speculatively, I think that this is going to expand far beyond cancer as well. One obvious application is looking at rejection in transplant. Again, you're looking at DNA coming from different tissues, but I think there's a lot of information buried in this DNA. It's not only about where the DNA comes from. It's sort of in the genome, it's sort of the patterns under there. You could look at epigenetic information and start using it as like a molecular signal for just health in general. Last couple comments. I think integration with other types of data is important. It's sort of illustrated here. It could increase your sensitivity for detection, especially early detection. So if you imagine sort of a disease stage where you have increasing severity or increased disease stage here versus biomarker intensity and different types of signals you could use to detect risk. The idea is, well, say pain, for example, arises late in disease. You might see signals where people have reduced activity or energy or something like that if they're feeling sick. Physiological signals might show up a little bit earlier than that, say heart rate variability, imaging, that sort of thing. And then molecular signals even earlier. And if you think about combining these sorts of things, well, as assuming that they're additive in some way, you can imagine a case where you start integrating this information to get even earlier detection via a combination of genetic data and other types of digital data. And finally, sort of long-term vision, I think that this needs to become part of something referred to as high-definition medicine, where you are now looking at people being characterized in a number of different ways, genomics just being one aspect of it, but a number of different sorts of molecular and physiological measures. They define a personal baseline of your health. So now what you do in this case is determine what sort of health risks you're at risk for at the baseline, and then judge your trajectory in health relative to that baseline. So not relative to the population at large, but relative to your own personal baseline. You'd see how well am I doing at managing my health. And then possibly you could even use those sorts of deviations to drive precision therapies as well, where you might look at therapies that essentially return you back to your personal baseline. So I'll end there. Funding, and this is work done by a number of individuals, not myself included. My contact information, and thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much. It was really, really interesting, and I think, again, we have a few minutes time if anyone has any questions or comments at this point for Ali Torkimani. Doesn't appear to be so. So we have asked for a couple of comments in advance from two commentators who work within the field of genomic research and genomic data. We have Mr. Markus Perola, who is a research professor at the National Institute for Health and Welfare. And we have Mr. Kimmo Pitkänen, who is director at Helsinki Biobank. Welcome on stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And it was a pleasure to hear from Ali. We do a lot of similar things that Ali described, and I didn't prepare any slides, but I took notes in the reflection what we have here in Finland, and we'll give some comments, and then Kimmo will continue, and maybe we can stay here and have a discussion after that. But a couple of minutes first for what I thought about Ali's excellent talk. First of all, monogenic diseases. So there has really been a paradigm change in going from phenotype to genotype, but from genomics to phenotype. Genomics really offers us now a way to narrow down to phenotypes to look into this, and this so-called reverse genetics has transformed the old school clinical genetics in many ways, and it's just the way it goes now, and I see it very positive. But what really a couple of Finnish issues that naturally come up now in Finland. First of all, in Finland, as most of you know, we haven't had this kind of a newborn screening, for example, for many inborn errors of metabolism as many other countries. For me, as a scientist, that has been a downer or a bummer because we don't have those excellent collections of total populations of blood drops that could be used for science as well. But of course, for us Finns, it has been good that we don't need to do that because we don't have those those metabolic diseases as do other European countries due to the population isolate and bottleneck background of our population. However, now when the cost of sequencing comes down and we can really start saving newborns and little children and even older people's lives by using high throughput sequencing, we might as a nation think again, should we have this kind of screening? When the sequencing is down to, now it's less than 500 euros, I presume in 10 years it's some tens of euros, like chip was 10 years ago 700 euros, now it's in FinGen 25 euros. So something like this will happen to sequencing as well. And when sequencing cost goes down to the regular laboratory test limit, then we can really make a benefit for children and older people for sequencing everybody at the maternity clinic maybe already. So that's something that we have to start thinking about already now. Another thing is that whether we want it or not, the genetics will come to all parts of the clinic. And there's a practical and very pragmatic reason for that, and I will already touch upon that. That's the cost. It's just going down, and there's so much information coming out of that. So really the resistance to change is futile. So we just have to adapt to this, that if we don't offer that as a public service, it will come out through private clinics and it will increase the health inequality in Finland and also be not so well regulated. So I'm not talking only about newborn screening, but I'm talking about people coming to, as is happening now in Las Vegas, people are going to a clinic and they get their genome sequenced, and in cases of unknown diagnosis, for example, cardiomyopathy or fatty liver disease, etc. For all those we know already mutations that can be really detected and useful for the practice, and that's something that's it's going to happen whether we want it or not, and we have to, as a nation, get ready for that. However, at the same time, we want to be sure that something that happened with PSA, prostate-specific antigen, which is not a genetic but biochemical test, happened, that these kind of new tests bring forth unnecessary invasive investigations, complications from them, and unnecessary worry for the patient and for the participants for the tests. And that's something, it's a balance thing that we have to have evidence-based data to really do this, but then again, we need to accept the realities, and some of these will come to the practice. And that's my comments about sequencing and monogenic disease. Then I go more for the polygenic risk score thing, which is really my field of studies nowadays. And I just have to tell you an anecdote. I told this to Ali earlier this morning, and I was at the medical conference in northern Finland a year ago, and there, the opening session where I was talking about genetics, modern new genetics, the chair said that all the genetic tests that we need are already used in the clinic today. And I beg to disagree. But this is a kind of a resistance we will face from people, and this is not like only because of not knowing things. These people, they do have some justification for their points, as I just mentioned about these unnecessary tests being done, etc. But we have to be careful when applying these new methods, not to hype these things too much and then end up with nothing or less than expectations, and that's always a bad thing. Polygenic risk scores will be, there are already 6 Finnish companies that offer these polygenic risk scores for customers. So you can go online, fill in your credit card system number, and you get the tube home, you spit into it, and you have some polygenic risk scores for you in a couple of weeks or in 4 weeks. There are 150 such in globally. So as a nation, I think we should again think about this, what kind of public money we should put into these tests and whether they are useful in clinic. Some of them will be. For example, coronary heart disease looks very promising, the test for coronary heart disease, but then again, we have to be careful what to take on and what is actionable and what is not. Do we test something just for the sake of it, or should we have something to do for the patient or participant because of that? I think we should. A couple of comments before I give the floor to Kimmo, but first of all, what Ali didn't mention, but I also work as a practicing physician, and I know in many cases the diagnosis is a puzzle. So you take a symptom there, you take a diagnostic test there, you take something else elsewhere, and you build up this puzzle, and then this puzzle tells you whether you should investigate this symptom more, whether it's a sign of serious disease or not. And these genetics tests, they are just one piece more for the puzzle. So we shouldn't throw away the old school medicine, not at all. I'm not proposing that. Some people have called me like a genetic fundamentalist or genetic believer. You may call me what you want, but the thing is that we are not trying to foretell. Prediction is not foretelling. We are not having a crystal ball that you will get the disease. We are talking about perception of risk, and genetics can give us tools to define that risk better. And that's for me as a physician, having one more tool is always a good thing, as long as it's tested. And then I will end it in what I always say, and what we really face now and what we need is education. We need to educate health professionals, we need to educate regulators, we need to educate citizens for this. And it is really important because there is an unnecessary awe or fear of genomics and all these new techniques. They are just medical tests, among others, in many cases. Of course, there are some specific things as to genetics. You know a little bit more about relatives, etc. But so, well, you can tell a lot about things about your relatives even by looking at you, for example, their appearance and etc. So this is not totally unique for genetics either. So we need to have open discussion and education, and I think we should start with health professionals and get the fear of genetics out of them.
Thank you, Markus. I'm not a geneticist myself, but I've had the pleasure and privilege to work for several years with professional geneticists. And I have to say that it's been incredibly exciting years. And directly continuing from where Markus ended, I can continue that what we need are real sort of practical first examples, concrete, perhaps sometimes small steps towards making this reality and taking for example, the materials and samples and data in everyday use in hospital patient care, not only research, but sometimes even part of the decision on the treatment of the very same patient who donated the sample to the biobank. So first, thank you, Sitra, for having had the pleasure to work in the Isaacus program in a couple of projects that have been funded as part of this program. And thank you, Ali, of course, for sharing your very clear thinking and vision on these topics and sharing the ambition, obvious ambition of yours with us on these topics. And I totally share your views and hopefully also your ambition on this topic. And when we think about the biobanks in the Finnish system, many of these topics are already reality. They are already practical, the practical environment where we are working and which we are developing obviously still further, but we are to some extent already there. We have the data lake systems, which was supported by Isaacus program. At the end of next summer, Helsinki Biobank and Helsinki University Hospital will get the genotyping results from the first 11,000 HUS patients back to the biobank, and the number will increase every 6 months by 15,000 or even 20,000. So we really need to get these assets in effective use, because, as is obvious perhaps, but sometimes forgotten, we do this for the patient. We do this for the individual, and the individual and the patient is really in the center. And we can see that at very different practical levels. For example, even though we don't yet have the genotypes from FinGen, but it has already activated not a huge number, but a substantial number of patients and sample donors to ask for their data and ask us what has been derived, what kind of results have been derived from the use of my sample. Could you please explain it to me, and could you please give it back to me? And we are not quite ready to do that yet, but we are working on it. And in a year or so, we need to have something up and running in order to respond. And as we very well know, and has been mentioned several times today and in previous contexts, I personally still feel and believe that Finland still has a unique combination of these different assets. So there's a certain time window which we must now utilize in order to get this in practice and make this a reality. It will not last forever, but it's very important that now the new legislative processes that are ongoing are made reality and taken to the goal. But at the same time, we need to be careful and avoid sort of over-regulation and making things overly too difficult than they in reality are. Of course, majority of our legislation in this area, or the framework at least, comes from the EU level, but much is still dependent on how we interpret the legislation, what kind of national legislation we write, and what is the ethical environment and atmosphere in Finland. And that's something, the area in which we all can come forward and present our views. So let's not spoil this by making it too difficult. Let's try to find a way forward, and then the others will follow us, as was in one of Ali's slides, the concept. So we, biobankers, feel the support of the individuals, the patients, every day. We are a hospital biobank, and our sample donors are HUS patients. They have come to HUS to treat and receive specialized care. They don't have a flu, they have something more serious. And the values and approaches to many of these questions seem to be a bit different in our environment than in the environment of presumably healthy population. And I would like to respect that attitude and willingness of the patients to take part in this activity. So let's give them the possibility to be part of this revolution, and let's make Finland, well, not great, but let's make this reality in the great Finnish way. We can do it.
Thank you very much for the comments. Are there any quick comments on or questions on what we just heard? No? Just a quick question from me. You mentioned about making Finland great again, and we just heard Ali told us what's going on in the United States. How would you rank Finland at the moment, the way we do genomic research and with the way we use genomic data? Where do we go at the moment in comparison to other countries?
Well, that's something that I would like Markus to comment also, but my view and interpretation is that this combination that we have is really a strength of us. There are, as individual parts, there are similar, even more powerful approaches, probably and definitely, but the combination that we have, that's still a pretty strong asset.
I agree, and the genomics research in Finland is at the quite high level, even in global scale. And how we have got there, it's really a multifactorial trait. So it's a long history of prominent figures, Albert Chapelle, Leena Peltonen, etc., who started this here decades ago, and people even before them, Jaakko Perhento, Varayo Norjo, etc. And combination of that and the fact that we are the largest genetic isolate in the world, that people are interested in investing to us, and also the well-kept healthcare, harmonized practices, etc., and good registers. So which now all feed into these studies on common complex diseases of public health interest. And I was just a couple of weeks ago in San Diego, where Ali's from, and there's an American Society of Human Genetics meeting, and it was full of talks from Finland, mentions of Finland. If the speaker was not Finnish, he was handling Finnish data, and even it culminated in that the major award, Allen Award, was given to Erik Lander, who has been also proposed to be one of the Nobelists for genomics in future, maybe sequencing the genome, but he was given the biggest prize in American Society of Human Genetics for his lifetime work. And his first slide was title was "How a Dinner in Finland Changed My Life," and it had a picture of Kappeli in front of it. So we are making an impact much more than our size.
Okay, thank you. And I think it's about time to take a little break. We'll continue at 10 to 3. So 10-minute break, and after that we'll hear more about cooperation, business, and many other interesting things.